Well, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Benefits of DRaaS, Disaster Recovery as a Service. Why managed disaster recovery is better than managing it in-house. My name is Joel Anderson, VP of Marketing here at Tier 4 Advisors. I look forward to today's session being hosted by Jake Sherrill, our founder and chairman here at Tier 4. Before I turn the time over to Jake, today's session will be recorded and will be available for redistribution. We'll send it out to all of you along with the contact information of our featured panelists today. We'd also love to hear from you during today's webinar. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. We'd love to be able to have those questions answered by our panel and Jake and Eric, members of the Tier 4 team. So without further ado, Jake, I will turn the time over to you and our expert panel.
Thanks, Joel, and thanks everybody for joining around the country. We are very excited about this subject. Before we get into the Q&A portion of the webinar, we'd like to introduce the panelists. Alvaro Gonzalez with Tierpoint, please tell everybody about yourself and your organization.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Alvaro Gonzalez. I am the AVP of Partner Strategy and Enablement at Tierpoint. For those of you not familiar with us, Tierpoint is a data center, cloud, and managed services company. Operating 40 data centers in 20 cities around the United States with kind of specialties in disaster recovery, in private clouds, and in IBM services as well. So really happy to be here. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Derek.siler with Flexential. Please introduce yourself to the group.
Hey, everybody. Happy to be here. Derek.siler. I'm a solution architect with Flexential. And for folks on the call that may not know who Flexential is, we're a leading provider of data center infrastructure services and cloud managed services across North America. 40+ data centers in small and large size markets, all interconnected with a 100 gig fiber network. Ideal use cases for customers that we serve are folks that are looking to go from that on-prem to colo to cloud, kind of multi-cloud or hybrid cloud solution, as well as DRaaS.
Excellent. jbailey with Island, please introduce yourself and your organization.
Excellent. Thanks for having me on. My name is jbailey. I'm Director of Sales and Channel Enablement at Island. If you're not familiar with Island, we're a global cloud service provider. We do hosting for infrastructure, disaster recovery, and backup as a service. We have 12 different regions throughout North America, Europe, Australia, and Asia, and have some great recognition of being leaders in the DR space. Thanks for having us on.
Excellent. And Erp McVey, our global CIO and seasoned veteran here at Tier 4.
So basically, I'm the old guy at Tier 4, 33+ years, but still take out the trash on Friday. So proud to be on the panel with our partners.
Great. And again, my name is Jake Sherrill. I'm the founder and chairman of Tier 4 Advisors. I was the crazy entrepreneur a little bit over 7 years ago who thought that there had to be a better way for our IT professional end user clients to do projects. And so I started Tier 4 to help with data center related projects. And over the last 7 years, we've continued to grow and morph into what we are today. So today we offer help around not only data center, but telecom, managed services, cybersecurity, and emerging technology type projects. Again, not as a vendor, but as a subject matter expert who literally and figuratively sits on your side of the table as a part of your team. And we're here to simplify and expedite the procurement as well as the architecture, the strategy, the planning, so on and so forth. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right in. This is a great subject. This is the 8th one that we've done consecutive weeks here at Tier 4. For these weekly webinars, and we are very excited to talk about DRaaS and the benefits of it. So let's go ahead and start with a definition, shall we? Jack, I'll defer to you first. Again, just as a reminder to all of the attendees, we do have a chat feature in this webinar. If you have questions throughout or you want us to dive deeper into a subject, feel free to chat us using the feature allowed here in the screen share Zoom meeting, if you will. Joel will get those to us and we'll go ahead and dive deeper as we can. Again, what is DRaaS and why is this cloud-based solution such a big deal? Jack, we'll start with you on that.
Yeah, so great question. Yeah, if you're less familiar with it, DRaaS is simply disaster recovery as a service, right? So think of it as the ability for providers like the ones on the call today to help customers eliminate the always-on, really resource-heavy approach to doing it yourself DR, right? And I'd say recent events are a really great reminder of this. Many of us have organizations that we work with or ours directly that have been impacted by the ability to purchase hardware, have people in the office or data center, have family and health obligations. So an as-a-service approach really reduces the complexity and the time-consuming nature of disaster recovery. But possibly most importantly, again, you look at the people on the call today, disaster recovery as a service, when done right, provides you with a lot of support and expertise as part of that offering, right? You look at these offerings, and as part of the core, you have the ability to have dedicated onboarding teams, account management, testing as part of deployment, self-service and fully managed offerings. With organizations like Island, for example, that's done thousands a year. So DRaaS provides you those resources as a service on demand, but also provide you a lot of expertise and guidance in the process as well.
And Derek, you have anything else to add there?
Yeah, I think what Jack was talking about is a really important point. You know, being that it's a managed cloud service, DRaaS is disaster recovery as a service, incorporating elements of cloud so that you're provisioning the storage and compute resources you need to spin up your mission critical applications in a hardened second facility versus the DIY approach. It's the management that really matters, right? It's the test execution. You know, the number one reason why your disaster recovery approach may not succeed when and where you need it really doesn't have a lot to do with the technology. The technology is going to get things where they need to be. It's going to be your people and processes, right? So when you have that trusted third party, that trusted advisor that's going to consultatively take you through, you know, how to tier your applications, what order to bring them up, what is the recovery time and recovery point that is right for those applications, and how do they fit your business criticality, that's what's most important, right? The technology is going to do its job. It's the people and the processes that often are the reason why customers or companies, fail to successfully recover from an outage.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Alvaro, I'm sure you have something else to add as well.
Yeah, I mean, so absolutely, you know, it's hard to follow Jack and Derek talking about this, you know, two guys who really have expertise in this. I have some of the gray hair like Eric as well, so have some experience about it. The one thing that I would say is that actually one element that got picked up, and each of us has kind of like a continuum between self-serve and fully managed that we can offer. But in particular, I think that actually it's the expertise of setting things up for the technology to get you where you want to go. And Derek, you kind of touched on that. The other thing as well, and especially it kind of favors the managed side, is this. When people have an emergency going on, it's also great to have the horsepower to actually do the managed part of standing the things up, right? That if you think about this from the perspective of, I'm in the boat and the boat is taking on water, I can be getting people into the lifeboat, but I have other things like maybe getting myself into the lifeboat that I need to account for at the same time. The people to carry out the failovers or to assist in those situations are also a really big value add that comes along with it.
So let's talk about some of the key benefits and you know, true value adds, I guess, that DRaaS brings versus the kind of the DIY approach. And Alvaro, since you're off of mute already, let's go ahead and start with you. I mean, increased flexibility, resource optimization, cost-effective solutioning, et cetera, right? There's many of them. But why don't you hit a few, and then we'll go around the group as well.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I would say that, right, starting with the as a service part of it, I mean, where a lot of people have come from has been less and less, but there's still a lot of it out there, where disaster recovery was, I back up the tapes, I get them off site, and then if something bad happens, I have this scramble to be able to get things back up and running. Disaster recovery as a service, first of all, lets you have an economic benefit that you can actually consume the services you're going to use to run in differently than having to buy them yourselves. It's a facility that you don't have to buy and maintain as well. And then also, just like Jack mentioned it, I used to work for Flexential as well, and all three of us, I think, will be able to speak to this. It's one thing to do something that you have had experience doing once or twice. And a lot of our companies that we work with, you know, maybe some people have had to pull the, you know, the red cord once or twice, whereas we as service providers have seen that happen hundreds and hundreds of times a year. And so the experience that you get from doing that also is something that's a really big benefit.
And Eric, I know you're on mute.
I could talk on it forever, but yeah.
Appreciate that, Alvaro. Eric, obviously you've had a chance in the last 5 or so years here at Tier 4 to be a part of probably over 100 different DRaaS or DR type of projects for our clients. What are some other key benefits that you see having came from kind of, running global infrastructure at Fortune 50 enterprises to what clients are using DRaaS for now?
Yeah, I think as technologists, we get the challenge, or not the challenge, but we get the benefits of having a DRaaS type solution. The challenge, I'll take a different turn on the question, see if it answers it, but the challenge is selling it internally. Is how do you get executive sponsorship to understand that I need to build a bigger bread box over here somewhere else so we can stay running? And the example that I've used a lot is every one of us have cars, and every one of us in the trunk of the car is a spare tire. And if we're not checking on that spare tire when we're going down the road, and if it's not inflated, we've done ourselves a disservice, right? We're stuck. So that's how a lot of folks have sold it to executives in the past. And so you equate that to the technical side of it. One of the benefits that I always did when I was in my shop was I never did like to have a 1-for-1 in DR. I always wanted to do an application rationalization. What's my minimum that I got to bring up to keep the business functioning, because I'm not going to live in DR forever. I want to fix prod and get back to prod and go on with life. And so there's an economics play in terms of a benefits as well, unless you're a big online retailer and you've got to be up 24/7 and you need the capability to flip back and forth. And so there's business cases for having that 100%, but from an economical perspective, it's best to kind of go through your stack and look at what is the very minimal thing that I need to bring up to make my business function.
And Jack, we'll finish question 2 with you. Again, any key benefits that haven't been mentioned yet that you wanted to throw in there?
Yeah, I'd say just to take a slightly different twist on the resource piece, right? We've touched on the fact that having always on resources at a data center is time consuming and costly. I'd say the people cost is another big thing as well, right? Whether it's the COVID scenario or even just recent times, we know that teams are stretched so thin. And the idea of facing the choice of, hey, do I focus on something that maybe again, it's better served with an expertise like this team could provide, or on revenue generating operations? And for many organizations, doing DR as a service allows their teams, as limited as they are, to better focus on those tasks which are better for the business.
That's right. And I'm going to go off script here for a half a second when you talk about the COVID piece and kind of the DIY. So we have clients that'll identify locations for a secondary colo site in kind of a faraway city for one reason or another. It's always fun asking why they're identifying, Denver or Salt Lake City, because they get to go out and do some work and ski as well at the same time, or there's some personal aspects to it, visit family, what have you. But, when you talk about the people component, I think it's an interesting point to bring up. And if we had brought this up 6 months ago, a lot of folks watching would have been like, yeah, that's never going to happen. But we've lived through this now. And, or, God forbid, another 9/11, when things happen and we're forced to stay at home, and your disaster recovery infrastructure or footprint, whatever you want to call it, is a long drive or a 4 or 5 hour flight away. And now you're no longer able to, go because of travel restrictions or because of shelter in place or a lot of these other things. Again, the lucky ones are going to be the ones that are deemed necessary workers and can and will be able to do those types of travels. But speak to that for a half a second, right? Because that's really where DRaaS in times like this oftentimes shows a lot of the benefits by being able to, pick up the phone and at the very minimum have smart hands to reboot a server or change out a drive or what have you, versus actual DRaaS itself. That's tied to an SLA and a statement of work, I guess, for lack of a better term, an MSA between a client and a vendor to make sure that stuff is ready at a moment's notice.
Right. Yeah. So I think you make a great point there. And I think if nothing else, COVID-19 has really made us look at processes, right? Because of the people and the steps involved, having something that's either software defined or as a service or that requires less time and effort has been so critical. And I think we'll see a lot of organizations try to adopt more and more of that, right? Because they've seen the efficiencies it brings. The other angle that I think is really critical you brought up there, Jake, is a lot of organizations, when they do it themselves, don't have the luxury of picking things strategically, right? And maybe the ski trip location, but when you hear about, Island having locations around the world and Tierpoint and Flexential having dozens, if not, tens of dozens of locations in the US, being able to pick strategic locations, not based on convenience of vacation or trips, but actual latency and access is also a key component as well, right? Something huge that DRaaS can offer.
Yeah, 100%. Derek, we're going to come to you for the next one to kind of kick off, and then we'll, again, continue to open it for dialogue with the panelists. But, we talk about security in the cloud. And I think when I founded Tier 4 Advisors, I've said this story probably 200 times. So for any of the attendees or panelists that have heard it, I apologize, you're going to hear it again. But when I started Tier 4, a lot of IT end users were using the words never and cloud in the same sentence, meaning we will never go to the cloud. And quite literally, that was only 7-8 years ago. And a lot of stuff has changed. The reason it was being used then was because of security and compliance and a lot of the concerns and the unknowns. What I find very interesting, and I think the real shift started maybe taking place around 2017 or even 18, depending on the organization, the vertical, the type of company they are. I think a lot of clients feel safer now in the cloud and working with a larger vendor partner to help secure things and consult with things and architect things, so on and so forth, than maybe on-prem in their own data center or their own data closet per se, like what we used to architect and deploy back in the day. So speak to that a little bit. How do I make sure that my DRaaS solution is secure? And what am I looking for as an end user if this is all new to me?
Yeah, I mean, there's the table stakes stuff, right? Obviously for data in flight, there's VPN tunneling. For data at rest, there's encryption of the disks. But I think from a customer perception perspective, they understand now that cloud as an IT consumption model has matured considerably, and all of the panelists that you have on here have DRaaS offerings that are HIPAA compliant and PCI DSS compliant. So it might depend upon the industry that a customer participates in, that there might be certain compliancy requirements that govern it. Another thing to think about as you're setting up a DRaaS approach, when it comes from the perspective of security, and this isn't necessarily the security in flight or security at rest, but actually a particular use case that you might be recovering from DRaaS is a cyber attack or ransomware, right? So one of the very prevalent things that are happening right now is ransomware attacks against essential businesses. So they're specifically going after and targeting essential businesses because they know those are going to be ones that are very likely to pay, right? To pay up the bitcoins and move on. So one thing to consider when you're thinking about potentially who to partner with is, does the technology, does that managed DRaaS solution account for things like journaling, extended journaling? Can they roll back 5 days? Can they roll back 15 days or 30 days to a clean system state so they can restore? That's a particular use case of DRaaS. It's very different than just the recovery piece, which is all about RTO and RPO, right? Recovery time and recovery point. In that case, you need to go back to a clean system state, and you're actually probably doing some forensic analysis on, how that bad actor was able to penetrate your network.
Yeah, excellent. And Erp McVey, will come to you on some other ideas that you've seen as well, making a DRaaS solution secure, and what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. I think simplifying it is a better way to think of it. So I used to tell my teams they were a little lax in checking the backups every night. And stuff would fail. 90 servers out of 100 would pass, and those 10 didn't. And their thought process was, well, it'll just catch up and back up tonight, right? backups, I made sure I helped them understand that backups were the most important thing that they did that day, because they never knew when the phone call was going to ring from the CFO that said, I deleted the budget forecast for the rest of the year spreadsheet. Can you restore it for me? And if it happened to be on one of those 10 servers that flunked the backup that night, you were just scrambling, right? DRaaS is the same thing for me. If I'm secure in my production and I'm spending a ton of money there, I never know when my DRaaS is going to become production. So I've got to spend the same amount of money securing there, patching, same firewalls, everything, because I never know when I'm going to have to make it my production site. So whatever protocols you're using on your production, you need to actually consider the same thing on the DRaaS side.
Excellent. We did have a question come in from one of the attendees, and she wrote, do you manage on your client's private servers, or do we rent space from you? She was trying to get clear on that. So the actual definition, again, of DRaaS to the attendee that typed this question, when you talk about your data on other servers, so the three vendors that we have here are vendor partners, Flexential, Island, and Tierpoint. If you were to do a DRaaS engagement with them, you would be migrating your data onto, let's say a virtual public, virtual private, dedicated private cloud type of footprint for prod. And then from a disaster recovery standpoint, your data, your backups, et cetera, would reside on servers that are owned and operated, metal that is owned and operated by the vendor partner themselves, helping you with your RTOs and RPOs. Getting a lot of head nods, so I must have known that answer. Thank God that I'm answering that one correct. All right, good deal. Again, hopefully that answered your question. If you do have additional questions, please reach out to us afterwards. And again, we are more than happy to continue to dive into that. Let's go ahead and jump into the next one. And Jack, we're going to go ahead and lead off with you. When I talk about public hyperscalers, virtual public, virtual private, dedicated private, right? I mean, it's almost like saying, hey, can you go to the grocery store and just grab me that one thing? And it's like, okay, what one thing, right? And that's really what cloud is today compared to what it was, again, even 5 years ago, which is great, right? A lot of options. But let's talk about public cloud versus private cloud. Does AWS make sense? A lot of people refer to, hey, pass me that Kleenex over there, but really it's a knockoff brand tissue paper. And a lot of people think of the cloud now as, I'm going to go to Amazon. And then we start talking to them candidly as an agnostic advisor, and we're like, no, the answer for you is not Amazon. The answer for you is a hybrid environment or more of a holistic approach rather than just ripping off the Band-Aid and going with one vendor to do everything. So speak to that for a second. Is there an advantage to one over the other? Is it truly one of those answers that it just depends on the client and the need?
Yeah, so I think that's all great points, Jake. I think maybe a definition up front is very helpful, as you mentioned as well. So you can talk about public and private cloud a couple of ways. For my definition today, I'm going to talk about public cloud as a multi-tenant environment and private cloud more as you are the single tenant within the environment. But again, it's a question that comes up a lot. So the other angle is public cloud, you think about Azure, you think about AWS. My simple answer on that before I dive into the other one is, when you think about your organization, you think about taking your virtual guests and live migrating them up to a different hypervisor type, a different environment which your team may have very little expertise on. Imagine doing that in DR, and it's like an instant migration. So the fact that the service providers on the call today can offer VMware-based environments and be able to maintain the hypervisor type and compatibility is a big one. But to the definition that I was going to speak to it, public cloud versus private cloud be more of a multi-tenant versus a single tenant approach. And I'd say it's the latter of what you said, Jake. There's use cases for both. One of the advantages of working with service providers like the ones on the call today is we can walk you through those unique scenarios, right? But there are a few specific use cases that come to mind that we can go through. Private cloud is a really good approach if you need fixed flat pricing in which the entire host or hosts are directly available to you. So good use case here might be, I've got a large number of always on workloads, or cases where I'm working with an organization that wants to test frequently or leverage the resources on a regular basis with more of a fixed flat cost model. Obviously, on the flip side of that, one of the pros that we've talked about already for public cloud would be the opposite of that, right? Organizations that like to take advantage of reducing costs to maybe just the storage they need until failover or test occurs, and then pay on demand for it as available resources. One final quick twist that I've seen with customers is they may like to do it based on licensing, right? If they're a heavy Oracle shop, they may actually go for private cloud to get around some of the considerations for licensing based on socket type or available resources. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but a very complex question. Hopefully that helps some.
It is, and it's a complex answer, right? Because again, the reality is it does depend, and there's no one size fits all, which is why, candidly, a lot of these projects, if they've never been done before, are maybe hard to do for those who aren't necessarily exactly seasoned in doing so. Alvaro, you've seen, clients coming to Tierpoint and prior vendors that you've worked for that say, hey, I just need disaster recovery. And they might even come thinking they need disaster recovery and business continuity. They don't even necessarily think about a secondary footprint in the cloud. Maybe they're thinking about just a cabinet of colo or whatever. Talk to me a little bit of, again, just kind of doubling down on Jack's answers, public cloud versus private cloud. What are your thoughts, what you've seen?
So I was going to ask, please don't make me go after Jack anymore, because he said a lot of really great things, but let me build on some of it though. He mentioned actually, this question of how am I going to get there? How am I going to address what is the thing that my business needs? And to pick up something that Eric said earlier too, and it's the spare tire, right? The spare tire metaphor that a lot of people have. The thing about it is this, the donut in your trunk, if you are driving a Toyota Corolla, that's the right way to get home, right? But if you're Smokey and the Bandit, you're eastbound and down and you've got to get the Coors Light to the wedding, a donut is not going to get it done, right? The workloads and the beds that they're in are going to dictate what you're going to use for your disaster recovery strategy. So, Jack had mentioned, if you have applications that are born in an AWS environment and it's hypervisor consistent to do DR into AWS, sensational all day long. That's usually not the case, but everything is there, right? That's not a super common use case. So following the lead of what you're protecting and how important it is to the business is the right strategy home. So that he mentioned the ERP use case. That's a really great one. We are seeing a lot more of that actually, where people are looking to do a full-on hybrid where we'll have, for example, and you mentioned hypervisor, I don't want to take it by either, doing production in either VMware or doing it in Nutanix AHV, and they want to have, in this case, for an ERP environment, like for like. But there are other things where they can tolerate not being a dedicated equipment, not even necessarily being in the same hypervisor, different RTOs and RPOs, and having a full suite of tools around that to be able to shape up, again, the right kind of spare tire. If, again, you're Burt Reynolds going away from Buford T. Justice, you want a different spare tire than if it is something that's not worse, not a real stressful workload. So that's how, the strategy is driven by what do you need and what are you doing in production to begin with.
Yeah, and Jake, I'll jump in there. I've touched on a point that a lot of clients out there don't think about, and that is the concept of recovery time objective, or RTO, and recovery point objective. They haven't done the business case as to how much is downtime actually costing me. And there's the concept of hot, warm, and cold environments. Some people that, they refresh their data. One of our clients, he said, I can be down a week because I don't get feeds from my clients, but once a week, right? So they're a candidate for a cold environment. So they just need to have something out there that they can turn on whenever they need to turn it on. Warm is somewhere in between hot, which is active. The point I want to leave with the audience, and you guys will agree with me, the closer you get to a hot or a near zero RTO and RPO, the more expensive it can be. If it's cold, it's relatively cheap because you're writing once a day, once a week, what have you. And a lot of clients are not thinking in terms of tying that revenue generation to downtime. We did that at a former company, did a full study on it, and that's how we've sold to the business active, before the concept was even out there, if you will, because a minute of downtime to this particular company was 7 figures. And because if they're not shipping, they're to your point, if they're not shipping, they're not billing. So I want the folks on the webinar to be thinking about that as they go back to their business.
Alvaro, you had something to add?
I was just going to say, actually, yeah, put that in the context of e-commerce, actually, right? We did one last year that had a pretty tricky setup. It was actually some x86, some IBM stuff all together. And initially, this company was getting a ton of pushback because the senior leadership was saying, that's a lot of money. I should just buy that myself. But actually going through the rationalization process, what they arrived at was, A, I get to spend the money at a different time. B, I actually get to focus on delivering value on the prod side, but then also C, the ability to have the expertise to deliver different RTOs and different RPOs and rationalize over time. The first thing they did actually was saying, what are the 6 most important applications out of the 600 that we've got? And they started there. And then as they can consolidate the scattered applications on the back end and move them, you move them in, you're shaping up your spend to where the value is. And you're getting to rationalize at the same time, and you have time to rationalize at the same time because you're not working so much on the back end, on the protection side.
Yeah. And Derek, we're going to come to you for the next one, talking about database servers being physical. Should someone consider making their DR counterparts virtual or like for like physical, or what is the thought process there?
Yeah, I think that can be, kind of either or. I think in any of the, the panelists that you have and the companies represented here from their DRaaS offer, could provision virtual compute resources that, would be able to handle into the IOPS processing of, physical database servers, right? So I think it's really just, analyzing the kind of workload and making sure that, you are provisioning the right amount of compute resources to handle it. But I'd actually like to go back, if I can, just real quick and kind of tack on and just sort of, signal my agreement to what a lot of the panelists were saying just before. I think when you're talking about DRaaS, fundamentally you're having a conversation about business continuity and selling a business continuity insurance plan, right? And so I think it starts foundationally, not so much with a TCO kind of conversation, but rather, what is the criticality of that application to the business? Do they have the people and processes and procedures, documented and in place? Have they tested against it? Are they successfully testing against it? I think when you kind of, you talk to a lot of these customers, whether they're, thinking about DIY, whether they're thinking about, DRaaS in a private cloud configuration, or thinking about, replicating to a hyperscale environment, what's really going to, potentially break down for them is, can they actually manage that and successfully execute, that test? So if you start this conversation as a tabletop exercise to show where their vulnerabilities are and their business resiliency, and you tie it back to the applications and those applications' importance to the business and what's the susceptibility to downtime for that, I think it's a much more successful sales process.
Yeah, that's great, Derek. I appreciate that feedback. With regards to some of the myths that we hear about DRaaS, Derek, we'll start with you on this one as well. DRaaS is expensive. All DRaaS services are similar. Once DRaaS is set, I can kind of forget about it, things like that. I mean, maybe tackle a couple of these myths that you've heard around DRaaS and maybe what end users could really expect in, exploring and implementing DRaaS in the future.
Yeah, one of the great quotes that I heard, and this is going back a little bit in the EMC days, right? So they were talking to somebody that was using tape for backup, and they're like, well, why do you expect me to move over to this, virtual tape library setup when I'm currently spending $50,000 a year to maintain my tape libraries? Why are you expecting me to spend 10x that? He says, well, hey, I can save you $50,000 a year, just stop backing up. Right? Because when you actually need to restore off of it, it's going to be, worthless, right? So I think, Yes, I mean, that's probably the number one customer objection, which is going to be DRaaS is expensive. And most often you're selling against a DIY scenario, right? Customers doing it themselves, replicating from production to a test dev facility. So I think it's really, again, it's almost counterproductive in my mind to have like a TCO comparison, because a lot of times the client is going to have this sort of emotional connection to all the fixed sunk costs that they already have in their data center operations. They already have their second site, they have a point-to-point connection, they've got dedicated infrastructure. So then you can switch that a little bit and say, well, how are you growing your production environment? And can you maybe reallocate some of that dedicated infrastructure you currently have in your test dev facility to expand your production environment and grow, and then take that DR workload and send that off-site, right? So it's maybe like it's switching the dialogue with the customer around some of the costs that they already have in their secondary facilities, and putting that more towards their production environment, and offloading their DR into something that's actually managed for them, tested for them, and they have the assurance that they're actually restorable.
Great. Alvaro, what myths have you heard or had to bust in these conversations? You're on mute there, Alvaro, just so you know, we can't hear you.
So just last week, it's really funny. I was dying for this question to come around. I was sitting here, and one of my partners comes to me and says, "Hey, I need some help." I'm like, "Sure, what do you got?" And they gave me, it was an analysis that a company that we were working on together was doing about a disaster recovery project. And they had, I think it was an accounting firm, come and do this big analysis for them, a TCO. And it was incredible because they had found a whole set of like storage and compute and switching and all of this stuff that didn't use any electricity. It was unbelievable. They did this TCO comparison, and it was the cost to buy the gear versus the cost, of our proposal, which was what it was, but there was nothing for power. There was nothing for space. There was nothing. I was like, oh my God, that's unbelievable. I need to invest in that. So, the TCO thing, it's totally true. People go down the rabbit hole, and I don't know that it's objectionable. I mean, TCO is smart. You got to do it. It's a smart business thing to do, but you have to do it right. You have to actually take into account what the costs are. The other thing I'd say is that all DRaaS services are similar. This is also one that, comes around. There's no doubt that each one of us who's on the call, each of these companies can do a really great job around disaster recovery. I think that each of us would have different areas where we most shine. One of the ones where we right now are making a lot of hay, actually, because it is something that's fairly unique that we're working on, are actually things where we have multiple hypervisors. We're doing very good work around that. And specifically, actually, things lately, we've had some great wins around people who have IBM iSeries, AIX, Linux on Power, or Z series, where it's really difficult to actually pull apart those things from the open compute, the x86, but people will try to do it all the time. And the problem is, people mentioned latency before, for example. They run side by side in production. Pull them apart for disaster recovery, because not many people can do both, and it's a catastrophe. So everyone is the same thing. That's one where if you're a Nutanix shop, you want to use Leap, you want to have it be commingled with other stuff, it's a very significant difference, and the IBM story is something pretty similar. So we all have things that are similar, but we're not all the same. We all have different strengths, and that's a pretty clear one.
Appreciate that. We just had another question come in from one of the attendees, but Jack, I wanted to give you a second real quick. Any sort of myths or things that you had to debunk recently as by way of a story that would be worth sharing?
Yeah, I got to say both Alvaro and Derek did a great job on it. The only thing I'd mention as well with DR is it's so easy to think, hey, getting the data there and failing over is a simple thing. But remember, the DR is all about ensuring end users have access to the data and a seamless experience. So the network connectivity, the UI that you use, the management teams you leverage, all these are so different with different providers. So finding the right one is a critical one to say the very least. But I think Derek and Alvaro already killed that pretty well.
Perfect. We're going to go a little bit off script because we had a question come in from one of the attendees asking about how do you document compliance / PCI on your end for customers? Maybe rapid fire here. Alvaro, we'll start with you. How does Tierpoint document compliance or PCI on your end for the customers?
So there's like a front end and a back end. On the front end, there are the attestation documents that result from every time, it's generally annually, you have to go back through the recertification process. You get the report that says, against all the measures, this is what we found, this is what it was, and that becomes a document that you share on the front end. Usually there's also, though, on the back end, someone's in and they're operating and they are getting audited. At that point, then, we collaborate with the customers to go through and assist them, because we, for example, all of it may not be managed by us. I see Jack and, Derek, I know in your case as well, it's the same thing. So in that case, we assist with the audit, because what's in scope for us, we help them with, and what's not in scope for us, we can't, so that's in a nutshell.
And Derek, anything different you want to add there?
I would say we probably will all have similar answers to this, right? It's front end, being able to provide the attestation document to say that you're, PCI DSS compliant, you're HIPAA compliant, and whatever the appropriate, regulatory compliance would be for the particular use case that the customer, is operating in. And then it's, like you said, on the back end, that customer will be independently audited so that, their environment, once it's up and running in steady state, can, pass that compliancy standard, that compliancy test. But yeah, I think all of us would probably, have a pretty similar response to that.
Jack, same with you. Good to go. Ditto.
Yeah. Just within the Island console, 20 or so attestations they can request on demand, just for that front end doc, as Alvaro and Derek were mentioning. Yep.
That's great. That's great. And I see Joel jumping on here. Joel, it's we might be getting the hook here towards the end of the webinar. So, Eric, another question that we had here: what are some new trends and I guess best practices in DRaaS we're seeing surface more recently? Obviously, we at Tier 4 we get a lot of opportunities to do a lot of these types of projects. What are you seeing? Or what is our engineering department seeing a lot lately that might be worth sharing?
Yeah, Jake, thanks. I'd go back in the essence of time and just talk about some of the things that people are doing to kind of dip their toe into the disaster recovery space, given especially now. They're kind of looking internally at some of the tools they've already gotten, right? Some of the native software replication solutions that are, present in storage stacks. If they get their storage off somewhere else, that's phase one for me. Then can I go do my application rationalization and then build out what I need to do, for my full disaster recovery as a service. The other thing, shared cloud storage has been out there for a while. The people think they know what's supposed to come up and come down, or come down and then come back up in what order they are. But more and more people are now doing run books and putting them off site in somewhere else. So that if my prod goes down, if I'm having trouble getting to my DR, I've still got run books over here, and I know what to what to bring up where first. Using Drive or Dropbox, or Box, pick your poison. Those are secure, and you can tie those run books down and still keep functioning if you can't get to it, in a production file share. But couple of more and more people are recognizing the need, I think, for DR. DR is different than business continuity. It's a first phase of business continuity. But I think these times, the last 3 months, I told somebody earlier in the week, I said, we're going to be more busy talking about business continuity and disaster recovery as we come out of all this COVID mess. We're going to be talking more about DRaaS and business continuity than we've talked about cloud, even our connectivity, in the next several months. So.
That's right. So guys, I got about 60 seconds left. Rapid fire. Derek, anything new, new trends or best practices that you're seeing real quick that you'd want to share?
Yeah, just real quick, I think, it's important when you're looking at a DRaaS program to take a consultative approach to it, right? It's not just the technology, it's not just the replication. It's, things like tabletop exercises to tier your applications, to make sure your policies and procedures are documented, that they're updated. When you actually do have a failover, your DR becomes your prod, right? So, you know, are you going to be running it off the most current copy of that production environment? And the only way to have assurances around that is to sort of have that managed services layer that wraps around that, saying, yes, we're going to take ownership over the life cycle of DR, right? As changes occur in your production, they're reflected in your DR runbooks.
Alvaro, anything 20 seconds or less that you want to add to that point?
Yep. Security strategy. Go into it thinking about access. I think Jack mentioned it, but think about scalability of network and scalability of VPN access, because people made plans for site to site, and the reality wasn't site to site, and people who couldn't scale had a rough time, right? So it's the security strategy and it's the access strategy that people overlook but are super important.
And Jack, 20, 30 seconds, final point for you.
Yeah, super brief. We already talked on it, the multi-cloud strategy, right? People have data everywhere these days. They're using different clouds for different purposes. How to unify that for DR? I think Alvaro just touched on that. Network connectivity is key. And as Derek mentioned, sitting down and mapping it all out. How do I access resources in AWS, in Island, and Azure across the board where they best belong? That's a key exercise you have to plan for in a new trend in DR for sure.
Want to thank all the panelists for attending. Want to thank all the attendees for coming and listening to the conversation. Joel, I was 2 minutes over. Back to you.
You're fine. Gentlemen, appreciate your input. Thank you. For those that are attending, if any of you have any specific questions about DRaaS, want to discuss it in greater detail, please reach out to a Tier 4 Advisors team member. We'd love to discuss that further with you and answer any questions that you may have. Please join us next week, Wednesday, 2 p.m. Eastern, for SD-WAN 2020, what IT leaders need to know. It'll be a very similar format to this, a deep dive into a specific piece of technology with some great subject matter experts that will be joining us. So again, thank you for joining us for this group, and then also we will see you next week. Take care, everyone.